So right now I have this car up on 4 jack stands, one here and on the other side, and one here and on the other side as well. Now this car is just about 50% weighted. That's because the transmission and the differential are all the way in the back of this car. So naturally, when we remove those things, this car might want to start leaning forward a little bit. To prevent it from going too far, once we reach that point, we'll put a jack stand or a jack right at the front subframe to prevent it from leaning too far forward. We'll start off by removing the rear suspension. So once your car is jacked up and your wheel is off, we'll need to take off the rotor and the caliper. We'll start with the caliper. Now on the back of the caliper, this is looking out from the inside of the wheel well, you have 1 and 2 22mm bolts that we're going to go ahead and take off. Sorry, those are 21, not 22. I'll switch to the other side because there's better light over here. So we'll start off by removing the brake line from the caliper so that we can remove it. If you're just replacing your clutch or something, this isn't a necessary step. You can and should leave this connected. You might just want to hang it somewhere like this. This nut right here on the caliper is a 13mm. You want to be careful with this fluid because it can take the paint off your car. I'm also going to remove the hard line now, which is a 13mm. Now keep in mind, every step I do on this side, I'm also doing on the other side as well. Let's go ahead and pull out this banjo bolt and put it back in the caliper. Take off the ABS sensor. And next we'll do the sway bar end links. To do this, we'll have an 18mm on the big nut here and an 8mm right here. We can leave that loose for now. The goal is to undo 1, 2 bolts at the top for the upper control arm, as well as 3 and 4 for the lower control arm. Once we do those 4, we should be able to remove the e-brake line, the shock, and pull this whole assembly out. But we'll start off by removing the tie rod end links. Spray some WD-40. It's a 19mm. You can also use a fork to hammer it out like that. Next, I'm going to take out the top 2 bolts, 18mm. All right, so with the whole top end loose, you can do the same thing on the bottom. So this bolt right here is a bit tricky. I'm gonna try to just loosen up this nut with my impact by coming at it from this direction with a wobbler. Now for the rearmost bolt on the lower control arm, we will do the same thing for this nut right here. And this front bolt right here is a 15mm. So now the bottom control arms are loose, there's no bolt in there anymore. Next we can disconnect the e-brake. E-brake is held on right here. There's actually another one right below it as well. All right, so we're getting pretty close. The only things I can still see that are connected are the top of the shock, which we can take out right now, and the axle. Hopefully that axle isn't too hard to get out. These are 13s. This is a 33mm deep socket. It's a 21mm up top and 18mm below. All right, so with all that out of the way, exhaust tube is connected up there. You can see it running up in here. Goes up and drops down. Now this center pipe of the exhaust is disconnected from the headers. You can see it just resting there. So we'll need to get this out of the way by unbolting it here and there. But as you can see, the car is still pretty low on the ground. What we're gonna need to do next is lower the subframe by 1, 2, and then 3, 4 on the other side. We're gonna need a lot of clearance here, so I'm gonna have to jack this car up a little bit more. That way we'll be able to get this center pipe out, lower the subframe, and keep moving forward. Okay, so right now this car is supported in 6 ways. We have 2 jack stands on this side and 2 on the other side as well. We have the jack at the rear as an extra safety measure underneath the rear subframe. And we also have this jack stand right here underneath the front subframe. So this car is pretty well supported in all directions. The next part of this process will be removing the exhaust from underneath the car. After the tunnel plate is removed, we'll have access to the back of the engine where we can take off those 5 torque tube bolts. It's like a 15 millimeter. Let's do the other side. Whoop. That's one way to get your exhaust bolts off. Only thing left now is the O2 sensors, so we'll take those off. All right, let's head under and we can see the plate which covers the whole torque tube. So all of these bolts will need to come off. After that, we should be able to lower the rear subframe. There will be space for it after we remove this plate. These are all 8 millimeters. All right, now we have a good view of the torque tube. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of these bolts right here that will need to come off. We're actually gonna leave the whole bell housing on. We're just gonna detach the torque tube. So now we can head back to the rear subframe and start lowering it down. All right, so back in the rear wheel well, there's just 4 nuts holding on this entire rear subframe. One here, one on the other side, and one there, and one on the other side as well. Now, because I have this rear subframe jacked up, we can go ahead and loosen all 4 of these, and then we'll go ahead and lower this on the jack. So these are 21 millimeter. So now the rear subframe is just held in place by this jack. If I move the jack around, you can kind of see it wiggle in there. Done this once before. You have to lower this very, very slowly because there's a couple wires still attached. For example, this ground wire right here that you can see. So we'll go ahead and lower this real slowly, making sure to unplug any wires as we notice them. All right, so let's go ahead and lower it by 1 inch or so and see how it's looking. Okay, I'm gonna stop it there. Make sure it's all good. All right, so from the back here, you can see those two brake lines coming up and over. I don't think they're in the way just yet, although I imagine they will be shortly. But what I can see right away is this electrical connector, which is that wire that we just disconnected. We could probably just pull this straight through. So now this electrical connector is clear. The only other thing I can see that's going to become an issue is the hard brake lines. So just keep an eye out for those. These definitely have a lot of flex in them, so we could definitely go down at least a few inches before running into any trouble with those. So let's keep going. Now you can really see this whole thing is just balancing on that jack. Probably a good time to get the transmission jack up and in place right at the rear end of the torque tube, just to give this thing some more stability. Brake lines still have plenty of space. Other one as well, so we'll go a little bit more. This setup is looking good. I'm pretty comfortable with this. We have a 2-ton jack here and a transmission jack holding it in place. This is safe to get under the car now and go ahead and see if we can get those torque tube bolts. So as mentioned, we have one on the bottom, one on the side, one here. There is one right here. I could touch it with my finger, and the other one right there, which I could also touch with my finger. So looks like the access is decent. They are 13 millimeters. Okay. All right. Is that guy? Very cool. 2 out of 5. And those are the 2 hard ones. Number 3. Number 4. Cool, okay. So I can see as I'm loosening this one, it's actually separating from the bell housing, which is great. So I'm gonna stop here and go grab my jack. So the jack is in place, holding up the torque tube. Actually a little bit of space up there. Number 5. One thing to note, the shifter is connected to the torque tube, so you're going to want to make sure that it is ready to slide down into that cavity. All right, so from the back, see that electrical connector right there. Just unplug this one right here from that electrical connector. Now would probably be a good time to snake these brake lines away. Pull them out. Now that guy is loose. And let's see the other one. Looks like they're going under the axles. Okay, well, there's definitely a lot of play there. I can't seem to get it out right now, but it could definitely go down comfortably another foot. So I think I can continue with the removal of this. Basically, my goal is to just pull it out by the sway bar here. The whole thing is obviously loose, and so I think I can just go straight back and pull this thing out. So that's the slave cylinder there, and this is the clutch line. And this little bastard is where they disconnect, right there. If I remember correctly, this white part here, it's not really white, but this kind of gray part in between this kind of green looking and yellow looking, this part needs to get shoved in, and then that way they will break apart. I have a few of the disconnect tools, so we'll see if I can find the right one that fits and do this in a reasonable amount of time. Maybe this one I'll do it. Oh yeah, that was not hard at all. Gotta have the right tool, man. This is the one, the black, what is that, 19 millimeter? That's the one. Basically, you take this guy, and then once it's there, it makes a really nice flush fit against this white piece. And you can push it in this way, at which point it shoves all the way in, right up against that. Full circle, not the 2 screwdriver BS method. This makes a full, even push against the entire circumference. Pushes it in, and then you can pull the 2 lines apart. So now it's time to pull this guy off. I think the last thing to do is remove the wiring harness. It's still running along the top of this torque tube. Apparently you can just pull it towards the driver's side. So we'll go ahead and give that a shot now, just to free it. The electrical connector up there, and there is where it's fastened. You can see that metal clip, and that's what needs to come off. Yes. Okay, cool. Wiring harness appears to be free now, which is good. Yes. So that's pretty much it as far as taking out the torque tube goes. Definitely make sure you have that GM fuel disconnect tool. That was clutch when it came to unplugging the slave cylinder. And then right at that final step, make sure you reach up and over the torque tube and push that electrical connection out of the way. And of course, watch your hard brake lines and the rest of those electrical connections. Now, my garage is a bit full right now, so I don't really have room for that whole rear assembly. So for the last part of this video, I'm just gonna disassemble it and place the parts off to the side. I'll take off the axles, remove the torque tube from the transmission, separate the transmission and the differential, and take off the rear subframe. So let's go ahead and finish that up. All right, so we'll remove the tie rod ends, the axles on both sides. That should allow us to move this out a little bit more, at which point I can remove the torque tube from the transmission and then finish up by separating the transmission and the diff, and then remove the sway bar. So this big bolt right here looks like it's a 15/16. We'll go ahead and do the same thing on the other side. All right, next we'll remove the sway bar. It is 18 millimeter nuts. I guess the bottom ones aren't in on this one. Next, we'll see if we can remove the whole lower subframe. Now at the back, there are 2 bolts coming down here through the subframe. They are 15 millimeter nuts. So we'll get those from underneath. Let's go ahead and take off all these bolts to separate the bell housing from the transmission. These are 13 millimeters, I think. Yes. So next we need to get this shift linkage off, which is connected right here. This needs to come all the way out. For the last part of this video, we will separate the transmission from the differential. That will be these 2 bolts here. There's one here and one here on the side as well, and probably some underneath. These 2 are 13 millimeter. This is 15 millimeter. This one here is pretty hard to see, but there's another 15 right in here. And then with the assembly on its side, you could see there's one more bolt hiding right there. think that's it.
Separating nice and easily.
So that's gonna do it for this video. It was definitely a lot of work. It took me 2 days to do this. To get the torque tube out was probably about 5 hours, and then to disassemble it, probably another 2 or so. I would strongly recommend a transmission jack for this job, as you saw, came in handy. As you're lowering that rear subframe, make sure you're watching out for all the electrical connections and the brake lines and so on. Make sure you're unplugging the clips. Make sure you have that fuel disconnect tool for the clutch line. And then when you're pulling out the shifter, you wanna make sure you pull out that one bolt all the way so that it can disconnect from the linkage. It's definitely heavy and unwieldy. I would put down some rags or some thicker like sweatshirts on the floor just in case you drop it. And then you're gonna be leaking some fluid when they come out. So just make sure you have a bunch of rags. And that's pretty much it, guys. That was pretty epic. You could definitely do it by yourself, as you saw. Just take your time, go slow. Make sure you line up all your tools beforehand. And safety first. Make sure you have 4 jack stands, 2 on each side, and then either a jack or a jack stand under the front cradle and the rear cradle. You're under that car pulling and yanking on things, you want it to be secure. So thank you guys so much for watching. In the next video, I'm gonna pull off all of the oil lines from my base. There's definitely a lot of metal shavings in there from when I blew up that engine. After that, we'll be ready to pull out the LS1 from the base. Until then, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.